All right. Is this on? Yes. Minister, thank you so much for joining us for this very important conversation on the scale of the Arctic threat. So first of all, of course, to address, given the theme of this conference, to address the elephant in the room, we had just a month ago a mini crisis, shall we say, over Greenland, over President Trump's remarks. Can you talk a little bit about, you are separated from Greenland by just like a not too large body of water. Can you talk about how that felt to you at the time and how you see it now?
So thank you, Rishi, and it's great to be here with FP, so thanks for inviting me. Well, it was actually more than a mini crisis. I guess it was a midi crisis, and could have been worse, because the whole idea that a NATO member would take the territory from another NATO member is something we never imagined happening, and it hasn't happened, thankfully. But even talking about this was quite a shock to the transatlantic family. So it was in many ways not only about the Kingdom of Denmark and the sovereign integrity of what Kingdom of Denmark is what we say about Greenland, Denmark, down south of Norway, and the Faroe Islands together. That's the realm, the royal realm. And the position of every single ally of the US minus the US was that whatever happens to them or their relationship is up to them and nobody else. So to the world, they're sovereign. So that was quite serious. But on the other hand, there were two messages that came out from Europe and Canada, which is that this is not going to happen. It can't happen. This is a red line. But also that we're more than ready to discuss security in the Arctic, because that's a real issue. But that's a real issue that should be solved through NATO. The Arctic, in a technical sense, consists of 8 countries. That's Russia, plus 7 other countries who are all in NATO. All the others are NATO members, so it seems, it's rather good. The club is basically a NATO club, and on top of that, the Kingdom of Denmark has also an old bilateral defense agreement with the US on top of NATO. So there's room for all of this. But then what happened is that because the pushback was so strong from the US closest allies, and because of political pushback at home, and I think also an increasing concern in the American economy and business sector that this, could destroy their markets in Europe, he stepped down, and he basically said in Davos, I was in the room, that there will be no use of military force. And a few hours later, he also withdrew the threat of tariffs, which is one of his favorite tools, against the countries who had sent a few officers to Greenland, not to defend it militarily against the US, but to show that we take care of their security as NATO members. So it has been diffused, and that's a good thing. And my sense now is that it will not come back in the old form. That's good. But that is an excellent entry point for actually discussing what we should discuss in the Arctic, which is something Norway and some of the other countries up there have been wanting for many years. So now we can move to discussing what is actually relevant, and I can speak about that later. But it's about transforming this new interest into something more constructive.
Right, absolutely, and I do want to get into the substance of those threats, but just a quick follow-up. Do you see, given you just laid out the sort of escalation, then de-escalation, do you now see this issue as resolved? We saw Lindsey Graham saying, forget about Greenland, it's in the past, but we have seen a tendency from the Trump administration for, even with Greenland, it's happened multiple times, where it goes away and then flares up again. So how confident are you that this time it's settled, it's done?
So in this day and age, I've become more careful about saying what will never happen, because things I thought would never happen is happening. But with that caveat, I think it's fair to say that I think this has now been channeled into, now there's a working group, and sometimes that's excellent because you have a working group and ask them to use quite some time in that working, then you diffuse it, and I think they will come out with something which is mutually acceptable, but in no way will include the transfer of sovereignty. strengthening defense ties, making some agreements on what not to invite from, for instance, Russian or Chinese investments. This is perfectly doable. So in that sense, I do think it's over. And I think you're right, it popped up again, but this is the time where it became so serious that the Europeans and Canada came to the position that now we have to say enough is enough. And there was actually quite a lot of pride in finally saying that, we're allies, we want to remain allies, but there are certain things you simply don't do. And it's better that you know that, right?
So now moving to the actual threats, of course, again, coming back to what President Trump said, the explanation for the US interest in Greenland was combating Russian and Chinese build-up investment. How big is that threat? And what are, if it's not that, then what are some of the major threats that a country like Norway sees?
So the most important threat, or the most important security concern in the Arctic, in my view, or particularly in the European part of the Arctic, is that just east of Norway's northernmost part, we have the Kola Peninsula. That's the largest concentration of nuclear weapons anywhere on the planet. But more importantly, it's also where Russia has its nuclear-powered, nuclear-armed submarine fleet, which is their second strike capability. And anybody who knows anything about nuclear war will know that you need to preserve a second strike capability in order to say that we can fight back even if we're attacked first. So, and this capability, which is submarine-based principally, has, since the Cold War, has been there because it's an ice-free. There are ice-free harbors. It can go into the vast Arctic waters. It can hide under the ice, or it can come close to America and Canada. So the real issue is how do you track and control and, if need be, attack these systems. And in the Arctic, if we now park this Greenland-US thing, there's actually no remaining disputes about land. There was one, very curious, there was a little island called Hans Island between Canada and Denmark, and it took decades to solve. Nobody lived there. Then they agreed, what they did? They divided into two, and then they found out that they could live with it, and that was the last land dispute. And then there's been some maritime disputes. They've been settled in accordance with the Law of the Seas Convention. So it's actually not true that people are trying to get land or water in the Arctic, but it is military. But this first thing I said is that given that a war erupts or a serious security crisis erupts for other reasons, the Arctic will immediately be one of the main territories for fighting it, because it's where you would start, that's where Russia would fight America from in a nuclear war. So what we do there with the US, with the UK, and with NATO is to track and follow and prepare for anything that could happen in a NATO setting, so that we can relate to scenarios where we'll go from no war to full war in hours. And that's the real concern, and it has very little to do with Greenland, because we know where all these ships and submarines are, and they're not around Greenland. And so does the US intelligence, because it's the same intelligence.
Right. So on that, you mentioned that, of course, Russia's an Arctic power, all the others are in NATO. We've seen two new entrants, the two newest entrants to NATO, Sweden and Finland, are in the region, very close partners, both physically and metaphorically. What impact has that had on moving the conversation in NATO towards sort of the Arctic?
Massively. I mean, as a Norwegian, we were so happy to see finally, after all these years, that our dear Finnish and Swedish friends joined the alliance. And remember that to our south is also the Baltic states and Denmark, of course. So now there is a continuous landmass from the Arctic Sea or the Barents Sea down to the Baltic Sea. Everything between there is now NATO, and to the east of that is Russia. And that has really strengthened. There's more NATO in the Arctic, and also more Arctic in NATO conversations because of that. And it's very relevant because if a conflict emerges, and these are the things we didn't think about for 30 years. We thought a lot about this in the Cold War. But then after the Cold War, we thought that wars were asymmetric. There were so-called new threats, which were allowed to be new for many decades without any questioning how long you're a new threat. And we thought it was Iraq and Afghanistan and the Balkans. But now we're back in a more sort of geopolitical conflicts and now rediscovering what would Russia do in conflict. Well, they would try to seize maritime territories, probably also land territories, for protecting their cola bases, which would be a locally defensive but strategically offensive purpose, so that they could retain the second strike capability. And of course, having Sweden and Finland in means that we now have much more military and much more control over land, which is under the same command, which is in Norfolk, Virginia, which is new, which is now sees this as a totality. So I would actually say that security in the Arctic, seen from my perspective, has been significantly enhanced by the entry of Finland and Sweden, but also the purpose of enhancing it has become stronger because of the geopolitical tensions between Russia and the West.
Right. And we're almost at time, but I want to get in one last question, which is we're seeing with Arctic's entry, we're seeing this kind of shift within NATO towards the Arctic priority that you said Norway has wanted. What is the one thing that you would like to see going forward, or the most important thing on the Arctic front to keep in mind?
So one would think, I think some of the audience would think I'm saying send more troops. No, we're okay. We basically have what we need, the command structures, the ships. Of course, we always modernize, but more exercising. We have something called the cold response, which is a big Arctic military exercise, 25,000 troops. Biggest contingent from the US, great, 4,000 in northern Norway, and get more internalize what Arctic security is and what it is not. Because, even in learned journals, I've been reading that there's a kind of a Klondike and you're looking for resources. But of course, since every interesting territory with some resources, or every seabed and anywhere close to land that could be relevant for resources is under some country's purview and sovereign control and or economic zone, it means that that's not really the problem. The problem is what happens in a military confrontation, and there the Arctic is coming back. So if, as I started with, if this newfound interest for the Arctic that was generated by a MIDI crisis in NATO can lead into more understanding of this, I would be the first one to celebrate.